So chapter 1 is a good introduction to the study of life and the study of biology. And in chapter 1, they talk about the things that we need to maintain life. So it could also be like the characteristics of life. Like what are some of the characteristics of living things? And so one of the things that we need would be boundaries. Okay, so you still need to watch that first lecture because this has in more detail. So we're just going to kind of review this a little bit. So what is a boundary that we just talked about in terms of a system? Integumentary. So the skin is a really important boundary. So sometimes people are born with defective proteins in their skin, and even a little bit of touch can cause the skin to break apart, and they get infections, and they're constantly having to bandage themselves up. And so it's a very awful genetic disease when that happens. But it just shows us how important the skin is for preventing infections. So boundaries are important for not only for keeping things out, but also keeping things in. So what is the skin keeping in rather than not letting it in, but keeping in? Blood. What else? Well, I'm thinking about one thing, like if you have a severe burn and your skin burns off, what are you like super susceptible to? Infection, but what else? Yeah. Fluid loss, right? So we have a boundary because it prevents infections, right? The skin, right? But it also prevents fluid loss, right? So water loss. That's really important that our skin prevents loss of water. The thing about us is kind of interesting though, a lot of mammals aren't able to sweat. So you know that your dog doesn't sweat, he pants. And so that's how he gets rid of the excess heat. We actually sweat, so we can lose a lot of water if we're sweating profusely, right? And we sweat in order to keep our body temperature at a particular level. Okay, so that would be just an example of some boundaries. Okay, so we also have movement. Okay. So internally, what are we moving around? Blood, right? So we have blood flow, and blood specifically transports oxygen, transports nutrients to the cells, but it also picks up waste products and picks up carbon dioxide, right? So the blood transports stuff. It also transports hormones. So it's really important in moving stuff around the body. Externally, obviously, we have, or other internal, we talked about was the digestive tract, right? Okay. What type of muscle is involved in, or is associated with blood vessels and the digestive system? What type of muscle, do you know? Smooth muscle. Okay. So this is smooth muscle. Okay. And so then we also have locomotion. And what type of muscle is that? Allows us to move. Skeletal muscle. The heart pumps the blood. Oops. The heart pumps the blood, right? So that would be cardiac muscle. So we have boundaries, we have movement, we have responsiveness. What does that mean? Yes, so it could be a reflex. So the nervous system is responsible for our ability to respond to stimuli. So it could be external stimuli, so like a reflex would be like something that we don't have to consciously control. So if you put your hand on a hot object, you will just reflexively pull it away. Or if you step on a sharp piece of glass, you'll reflexively pull your leg back, right? And so this is responsiveness. This is to external stimuli. Not external, yeah, to external, sorry. External stimuli. Okay. But there are also reflexes that are internal. What would be an internal reflex? It's a nerve, so it's still the nervous system, but what type of stimuli is inside of our body that is causing a response by the body?
Like breathing,
Vomiting, right? Maybe vomiting, right? So why do we vomit? Right, so our hypothalamus can detect if there's toxins in the blood. So let's say, maybe it could just be alcohol, right? So maybe you drank too much too fast, right? And your hypothalamus detects that, and then it causes you to vomit up any alcohol that you may have in your stomach to prevent it from getting into the circulatory system and causing further escalation of the alcohol response, right? So vomiting would be a good example of an internal response. But what about heart rate? So we have internal stimuli. Why does the heart go? Why does the heart increase when we exercise? Right. So if you use up oxygen and you produce specifically carbon dioxide, so if I'm exercising, I'm producing lots of carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide is going to build up in my blood. My nervous system is going to detect that, and it's going to boost my heart rate and my breathing rate so that I can get more oxygen out to my body, out to my muscles, and then I can get rid of the excess carbon dioxide. So that would be a good example of internal stimuli. So oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations in the blood. So responsiveness. Okay, we also have digestion. When we think of food, like if you were planning on what you were going to eat, what types of things do you take into consideration? What did I say? Food groups. I take in the food groups. So if I am craving pasta, what am I giving my body? Carbohydrates, which are also sugars, right? So sugars are primarily used for energy, right? So when we talk about the digestive system, we could talk about needing energy. Right? So we'd say, oh, I need to have carbohydrates because I'm going to go run a marathon, right? So I need to build up my carbohydrate, my glycogen reserves, right? So energy is important because our body uses the energy to maintain the boundaries, right? It uses it for movement, and it also uses it in the nervous system for responsiveness. So energy is required by a living organism simply to maintain life, right? Otherwise, things tend to go to a state of disorder or a high state of entropy if we don't have energy to maintain the order within our body, okay? So when we're looking at the food we eat, we might also consider nutrients. Okay. So nutrients are building blocks. They could also be, so like for example, if I am lifting weights, what might I want to eat? Protein, right? Because I need the amino acids in order to build more protein to make my muscles bigger, right? So an example would be protein. Okay. But we also need things like vitamins. And a lot of the vitamins that we take in and that we require are what are called coenzymes. And we're going to talk about enzymes a lot this quarter. But an enzyme generally is a protein that speeds up a chemical reaction. So vitamins are oftentimes necessary for chemical reactions to occur in our body. And so they're not the building blocks, but they're required for the chemical reactions to work in our body. So that's why they're called coenzymes. They help. So what's an example of a vitamin that is essential that we have to have in our diet? Vitamin C. And if you don't get vitamin C, like the people that were on the ships and there was no fresh vegetables or fruits, then what did they get? Scurvy, right? So it's the scurvy dog that the pirates, they call themselves. So they would get skin blisters, you know, and their immune system wouldn't work, their body would start to break down. Okay, so vitamin C is a required nutrient. So if you're looking for vitamin C and you didn't know, like if you couldn't go to the grocery store, let's say, and you were like out, you know, and just foraging for food, how would you know if something has vitamin C in it by taste? What does it taste like? Sour, right? So it's kind of acidic, but it would be a sour, and so a sour taste, right, tends to have vitamin C. Okay, we're almost done here. Excretion. I didn't use that word in my handout, but what is excretion? What system is the excretion associated with? It's actually two systems. Urinary and what else? Does anybody know? Digestive. Not digestive, that's egestion. So that would be getting rid of digestive waste is separate from getting rid of metabolic waste. Metabolic waste. Okay, so metabolic waste. So the urinary. What else? One more system. Integumentary, excellent. Okay, so this is sweat, right? Also, so sweat can have in it urea, right? So the urine has urea in it. So when we sweat, we're releasing water, but we can also it can also be acid. So sometimes our sweat is more acidic than other times. And urea, when you get sweaty clothes and you leave them and don't wash them when you should, right? They'll start to smell oftentimes like ammonia. And that's because there's bacteria that will break down the urea and break it into ammonia. So ammonia, your clothes smell like ammonia, and you can put vinegar in your wash to neutralize it, right? And it will take the smell out. But that's because of the breakdown of urea that you get ammonia. Okay, so this is important because it is a waste product, right? And we have to get rid of it or it would become toxic. Reproduction. So obviously as a species, in order to maintain our populations, we would have to reproduce, right? And reproduction is really interesting because, to me, because if you think about it, all the cells, or the majority, the vast majority, almost all of the cells in my body right now will die when I die. So the only reason why, from an evolutionary point of view, why the cells in my body are all cooperating is because when I was an embryo, there were certain cells that they in embryonic development, they call it seeded. So certain cells were put into my ovaries, and those cells have the ability to be immortal. So those cells have the ability to possibly turn into eggs, possibly be fertilized, and possibly produce a whole new individual, right? So the idea of reproduction, sexual reproduction, is very interesting when you think about it from that perspective, that all these other cells are just cooperating in order to house those cells that could potentially be passed on. Okay? So what I just described was sexual reproduction. Okay. And that's the production of offspring that are genetically different. They're genetically distinct from you because they're a combination of the male and the female. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about genetics and cell division this quarter. So we're going to talk a lot about that type of reproduction. That's the most common type of reproduction. Some organisms can reproduce asexually or essentially clone themselves. And then we have growth. So if you think about it, we all have started out as a single fertilized cell. So at one point in your life cycle, you are a single cell. And then that cell was able to undergo cell division to produce many, many, many cells that then allowed you to develop and eventually be born and then to grow. And so when we look at growth, we look at actually asexual reproduction via cell division. Okay, so you start out as a single cell and you become multicellular adult. Okay. And the thing about growth is that even as an adult, there are cells in my body that are dying and that have to be replaced. Right? So my skin cells are constantly being slept off, and then the cells underneath my skin have to undergo asexual reproduction. They have to divide, and then and replace the skin, the cells that are being slept off. The really interesting thing, however, comes in terms of like the rest of our body. So even our skeletal system is not fixed. So our skeletal system is broken down and rebuilt about every 5 years. And if you go into outer space where there's no gravity, your skeletal system will become really weak, right? If you lay in bed, your skeletal system will become weaker. If you get up and you move around and you do lots of weight-bearing exercises, then your skeletal system gets bigger and stronger. And so the skeleton even responds as an adult. It responds to responding to stresses on it and what is going on in the environment. Now, we used to think that the brain, for example, was completely static, that once we become an adult, the brain just stays exactly the way it is. And there's lots of new evidence that suggests now that what's going on in your environment can either cause your brain to expand, like cells can divide and grow, and those parts of your brain will get bigger, or parts of your brain will shrink, right? And parts of your brain can get smaller and cells can die. So we even know that growth and death occurs in the central nervous system now. So it's not, our brain does not stay static when we are an adult. Okay, so those are the things that maintain life. Now, the other things that I talked about in the first chapter was what was called survival needs. Okay. Or requirements for human life. Okay. So I'm not going to go over these, so you don't need to write that down. So when you watch the video, you're going to talk about the survival needs or the requirements for life. Okay. So you need to watch that video so that when it comes time for that quiz and for the midterm, you have those notes. But we're not done yet. Okay. So I'm just going to skip over that. Oops. I want to review or introduce you to this idea of homeostasis. So what does homeo mean? Same. And stasis means state. The same state. So this is the idea that we have to regulate our internal environment and keep it relatively stable. So this is the internal regulation, or the regulation of the internal environment. Now, homeostasis might be a little bit of a misnomer, however, it might not quite make sense, because what we really see is that the internal environment fluctuates and it responds to the external environment. So it responds to what's going on, right? So there's some responsiveness. And so probably a better way to describe homeostasis is that it is a dynamic equilibrium. So what that means is it fluctuates around a relative constant state, right? So if we're looking at, this is the steady state temperature. Your body temperature stays exactly that, right? Does that happen? No, right? So we exercise and then at night, your body temperature actually drops in the middle of the night, right? And you get your set point for your body temperature. And so really, it's not this, but it is more like this, right? It fluctuates a little bit, right? So it's not a straight line. So we see that it is more of a dynamic equilibrium, and we generally need to keep it within a particular range, right? So what is the mechanism? Does anybody know what is the mechanism by which we regulate our internal environment? It's a feedback. What type of feedback? What do you think? Negative or positive feedback?
Negative.
Negative. Okay. So we have what is called a negative feedback mechanism. Okay. Some people think negative, this means that it must be bad. That's not what it means. Positive feedback mechanisms are generally bad for the body because they do not regulate homeostasis. It's the negative feedback mechanism, meaning that it is negative in that the response to the stimuli will decrease the stimuli. So it tends to regulate. So if we think about the temperature in this room, for some reason it feels like the set point is pretty low. It's kind of chilly in this room, right? So once the thermostat reaches that point, then it kicks the heat in. And then if the temperature goes above the set point, then it shuts it off, right? And then it keeps the temperature at a relatively constant state. That is very different than if you have a manual thermostat. I don't know if you guys have that at home. I used to have one, right? And it was constantly like, oh, I'm cold, 90 degrees. Oh, I'm too hot, go back down. So it was like, I was kind of trying to get it, but it would never stabilize, right? The temperature would never stabilize. But with the thermostat, it does, right? And you get this relatively constant, 68 degrees in your house. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to give you a handout that talks about this negative feedback mechanism, and we're going to go over it. And this will be the last one. No, for some reason last year, I had a student that just never got into the campus. I'm like, I can't tell you. They used me to be very, the person that called house. I emailed him. So. Okay. So before you look at that, okay, I want to talk a little bit about the components of the negative feedback mechanism. Okay. So in the middle, is there some could you hand those up? So write set point somewhere in the middle of your page.
Like,
No, on a separate piece of paper.
oh,
On your notes. Somewhere in the middle. Everybody get a handout now? You can write on it, but I'm going to write on this. So I mean, you could do whatever you want actually. Okay. Okay. So we have a stimuli. It is really important to realize that this stimulus could be internal or it could be external, right? So it could be the inside of your body. This could be the temperature of your blood, right? Or this could be an external stimuli as well. So it could be the temperature outside the body. Okay, so this is the stimuli. And we have to have some ability to receive that stimuli. So we have to have a receptor. And so the receptor is part of the nervous system. So the receptor is able to detect the stimuli. Right? Then it sends the signal from the receptor to what is called the control center. This is oftentimes the brain, but it doesn't have to be the brain. Sometimes, like for example, in the example that we're going to go over today, the glands, the thyroid and the parathyroid glands are actually the control center. They have receptors and they actually initiate the response. So the control center initiates the response and it sends the response out to what is called the effector. The effector then sends a response or has a response that decreases the stimuli. Right? And it goes back to the stimuli. So these pathways have names. So specifically, this pathway is called the afferent pathway. This pathway is called the efferent with an E. So I just like to remember, A comes before E. So afferent, receptor to control center out to the effector, because also this is effector, right? This causes the effect, right? So it's E, right? So just remember it, E's go together, okay? The effector leads to the response, and that response decreases the stimuli, and it keeps whatever we're talking about at its set points, okay? Okay, so let's look at the example of calcium concentration in the blood. So this is what we're looking at, this one right here. What is the set point? What is the normal calcium level? 10 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, so this would be my set point. Okay. So the stimulus would be this right here, this increased calcium level. This would be the stimulus. Okay. Both the receptor and the control center are actually the thyroid. So the thyroid gland would have receptors plus control center. So that would be the thyroid gland. Okay. So we need to get, if our calcium levels are high, we need to decrease the calcium levels back to our set point. And so what we do, one of the ways we do that is we increase calcium, or actually we decrease calcium reabsorption So we get rid of some of the calcium via urine, right? So this would be right here, this would be one effector. Oops. So this would be an effector. Actually, both of these would be the effectors, okay? So this would be the bone, right? So the bone stops the breakdown of calcium. Or the breakdown and release, sorry, and release of calcium. So normally, calcium can be stored, calcium can be stored in our skeletal system and it can be released, okay? So we store calcium in our bones. So if you don't have enough calcium, if you're not taking in enough calcium, your bones are gonna get weak, especially like if you're my age and a female and white, that tends to be a problem, you get osteoporosis. So then this would mean that you're going to get rid of calcium in the kidney. This would be getting rid of it in the urine, okay? So calcium, the kidney, calcium in urine. Okay. And the response of both of those has a negative feedback mechanism, and so it brings the level of calcium back down to the set point. Okay, so let's look at what happens. This is more common, actually, if calcium levels are too low. Okay. So instead of the thyroid glands, the control center is the parathyroid glands. The receptors in the control center are parathyroid. Okay. So again, the effectors in this particular instance are the bone. And so this means that the bone is broken down and calcium is released. So I mentioned that before, like if I don't take in enough calcium, they're like, oh, you're gonna need to check your bone density, right? So they want you to take calcium, drink milk or dairy products, right? Or take calcium in order to keep your bones strong, okay? So this is, bone is broken down. Calcium is released into the blood. Okay. Okay. In the kidneys, calcium is retained by the kidneys. And we absorb more calcium in the small intestine. And then that's going to have a negative feedback level, and that's going to bring the calcium levels back up to their set points. So what's it called, if you look at your sheet of paper, what's it called if your calcium levels are too low? What's the term is used? If your calcium levels are too low, you might have to look on the first part of that page. Hypocalcemia, right? So this is hypo. Hypo is low, right? So that's used a lot. Hypothermia would be that you are cold, right? So what's the opposite of hypo? Hyper, right? So if your calcium levels are too high, you have hypercalcemia. Oops, calcemia. Okay. Okay. So does everybody understand why this is considered to be a negative feedback mechanism versus a positive? Positive would be that the response would increase the stimulus. So it's like, oh, the response to increased calcium levels would cause the bones to release more calcium into the blood, and there'd be more calcium and more calcium and more calcium. It would be like a runaway thing, right? The negative aspect is that the response always decreases the stimulus. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about today. And so I would recommend that if you have time soon, you should watch the first lecture. And then by next Tuesday, you should make sure that you have watched both lectures. And you either have lab tomorrow at 2. The lab is in ST115, which is in the basement of this building. Or you have lab on Thursday at 9. And if you haven't done so, note whether or not you have access to Canvas. Because that'll be really, really, really important. Yes. Do you want to do that in private or where? It is private. Okay. You'll miss the lab, but you can do the bonus credits to make it. Yes, it's detailed online on the Canvas site.